Okay, folks, this is part two. Let me just set my timer here so I don't go too long. Boom. All right, so let's turn now to disorders of self. These are categorized as personality disorders in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. So these are different than the other, mental illness labels. Some people's identities cause them to interact with the world in maladaptive, which means non-helpful, and inflexible ways. And when this style of interaction is long lasting and causes problems for them in life, then we might call it a personality disorder. Okay, so they are maladaptive ways of relating to the world that are long standing and pervasive, right? Like the person's pretty much always been this way. So the DSM 5 identifies 10 different personality disorders. You can think about them as 10 different kinds of difficult person, right? And they divide them up into three clusters, cluster A, cluster B, cluster C. So there's the odd eccentric group, there's the dramatic unpredictable group, there's the anxious fearful group. If you go on in psychology and you take Psych 206, right, psychopathology, you get to learn about all of them. We're just going to touch on a couple out of the dramatic unpredictable cluster. We're going to look at borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. So let's start with borderline. Something like 1 to 2% of the population meets the diagnostic criteria here, with women being more likely than men to get this diagnosis. And this is marked by instability in mood, emotion, identity, poor impulse control, self-destructive tendencies. Right? So the borderline person, kind of the key feature here is lacking a strong sense of self. And so sort of trying to figure out who they are beyond sort of the developmental stage where everybody's doing that, right? The borderline person generally doesn't like being alone, often has a fear of abandonment, and that can make them sometimes difficult to be in a relationship with because there's this sort of clinginess about it. And the borderline person can be quite manipulative in relationships as well. So, for example, saying things like, if you leave me, I'll kill myself, would be a form of kind of emotional blackmail that the borderline person might use. Emotional instability here, episodes of depression, anxiety, anger, irritability, mood shifts that come out of nowhere, polarized thinking, which means everything is either wonderful or terrible, or they think of you as a terrific person or they hate your guts. So there's like this volatile component to the borderline person's relationships where it can feel like being on a roller coaster, right? When they love you, they love you. But if you've done something to upset them, then they might express hatred, right? There can be some impulsive behaviors as well, which can show up as sexual behaviors, physical aggression, binge eating, self-harm, high risk of suicide attempts, suicide. And, interesting and I think very telling is this link to trauma that has been found for borderline folks. 70 to 80% of patients with borderline personality disorder have experienced abuse of some kind or have witnessed it happening to somebody else. Okay, so that's borderline personality disorder. The other one we're going to look at is antisocial personality disorder. So this is a diagnosis for people who behave in socially undesirable ways, like breaking the law, lying, cheating, using other people, and so on. From 1 to 4% of the population in the US meet the criteria here, more common in men than women, and apparent in late adolescence, early adulthood. So in fact, if the person is younger than 18 and shows these symptoms, we have a different label. We call it conduct disorder. But they kind of age out of that by 18. And if the behaviors are still there, then they kind of age into this label of antisocial personality disorder. So the person with APD takes advantage of others without showing empathy or remorse, is focused on immediate gratification with no thought for others. So it's just about wanting to satisfy one's own impulses. not caring whether it's going to hurt somebody else. The person with APD tends to be insincere, meaning they'll lie. They tend to lack in insight, so they don't seem to recognize sometimes the effect that their behaviors and choices has on other people. Incapable of love, incapable of empathy, which is being able to feel other people's feelings. They tend not to become anxious when they experience unpleasant stimuli. So, for example, they could be holding up a bank and their heart rate doesn't go up, their blood pressure doesn't go up. They could be in pain, but again, their body isn't reacting like other people do. And so, yeah, they don't feel fear or anxiety like others do. Some suggestion that things might improve for some folks when they get to middle age, but that's kind of controversial. There's also evidence that people don't improve, so it's hard to know for sure whether that's a thing. Now, the term psychopath refers to a related disorder. So psychopaths display more extreme behaviors than people with antisocial personality disorder, less impulsiveness, more intentionality, more planning, for example. So, for example, we got Ted Bundy here, who was a serial killer, who's kind of a textbook psychopath. He was a smooth talking, intelligent, good looking guy who was able to use those assets to manipulate people, right? So, very high sense of self worth. He felt entitled to do the things he was doing. Unemotional, manipulative, lacking empathy, hard-hearted, and any way you want to say it, the person does not care about other people's feelings and has poor ability to even know what someone else is feeling. So, I mean, some psychopaths are living within the bounds of the law, but some are not. And a lot of serial killers kind of meet the criteria here for psychopathy. So the cold-blooded killer, the Ted Bundy kind of idea. These folks can come across as charming, a good catch, but that's all just a facade to hide sort of the monster under the surface. If you're interested in serial killers, I know a lot of people are, Ted Bundy's an interesting example. And Netflix has this series, Conversations with a Killer, the Ted Bundy tapes. I recommend it. When he was in prison awaiting execution, he sat with a journalist and kind of spilled the beans about himself and what he did. And it's a great kind of peek into the mind of a psychopath. Okay, so terms that we have to make sure we know: borderline personality disorder and what that involves, this weak sense of self, fear of abandonment, manipulativeness, emotional instability, impulsiveness, the link to trauma here for a lot of folks, and then antisocial personality and this related idea of the psychopath. Okay. Next up is eating disorders. So eating disorders are about 4 times more likely for females than males, although males can obviously experience eating disorders as well. So we're going to take a look at some common eating disorders, starting with anorexia nervosa, which involves an excessive fear of becoming fat, leading to a restriction of calories and a body weight that is much lower than optimal. Right? So this can be a life-threatening thing. And even though they become extremely thin, people with anorexia have a distorted body image, perceiving themselves to be much larger than they are. So they could be sort of desperately underweight and feel like they still need to lose a few pounds. Usually beginning early adolescence, so 12, 13, 14-ish. And, I don't want to trigger anybody with explicit images here, but this was a model walking the runway 2006, a few weeks before she died. And, this was held up as an example of what women are supposed to look like. So, the whole topic of anorexia and body dysmorphia has to sort of fold in the pathological imagery that we're kind of surrounded by, right, in society, particularly girls and women. Anorexia might also include purging behaviors like barfing So eating and barfing, laxatives, excessive exercise to burn off calories. So anorexia can cause serious health problems, including heart disease, loss of bone density, death due to starvation, and there's a high suicide rate for people with anorexia. So how does one diagnose it? The criteria include food restriction, so the person is deliberately restricting calories, a body weight significantly below what they should have, an exaggerated fear of gaining weight, dissatisfaction with one's own body, and believing oneself to be heavier than one is, the dysmorphia there, and denial of how serious the condition is. Okay, so that's anorexia. Bulimia nervosa involves alternating between dieting, binge eating, and then compensating behaviors like purging. So this has a later onset than anorexia, somewhere around late adolescence, usually. 1 to 2% of people in high school and college meet the criteria, mostly women, who tend to be of average weight or maybe slightly higher than average weight. So again, you've got the distorted body image where the person thinks they're much bigger than they are. And the binge eating component is often secretive and experienced as compulsive. So the person, says that they feel like they can't not do it, followed by compensatory behaviors like barfing it all up again, excessive exercise, using laxatives to get rid of the food, and so forth. And then there's binge eating disorder. This is when a person has these binges, these compulsive binges, at least once a week, but there isn't the purging. If there was, the purging that followed it, we'd call it bulimia. So this is the binging without the purging, often accompanied by feelings of shame, embarrassment, guilt, which is also true for the bulimic person as well. And because there isn't the purging, this can also show up, accompanied by obesity, unhealthy weight gain. So while people can look quite different, right, depending on which of these eating disorders they have, they're all cut from the same cloth. They're about a dysfunctional relationship to food and the body. All right, so anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorder. Okay, probably gonna pause here and we'll pick it up in the next piece.